Well, this is the third installment, my sketchy talk with my Patreon. And today we welcome Ryan Claytor. He is a comics artist and professional living in Lansing, Michigan. He also has an international client list, which includes Moleskine, Verizon Wireless, Stern Pinball Incorporated, and London-based Mr. Jones Watches, which I'm going to be very interested to hear how you got that one, for whom he designed the fastest selling watch in company history. He coordinates the Michigan State University Comic Art and Graphic Novel minor and teaches comic studio courses at MSU. His work has garnished numerous awards, including top prize first place in graphic novel category at the Small Press and Alternative Comics Expo, which we know as SPACE, annual awards. Other achievements include a cartoonist in residence position at the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco, California, which I love that museum. That's really cool. Mm-hmm. Visiting lectureships at the Dallas Museum of Art and Savannah College of Art and Design, and an internship with Marvel Comics in New York City, and judging the Will Eisner Spirit of Comics Retailing Award in 2007. In 2009, the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco featured an exhibition of his work, and Claytor both developed and taught the first comic studio course in Michigan State University's history. Wow, that's an impressive list of credentials.
I was going to say that's probably enough. We can stop there.
You're like, please, no more. No, it's really interesting.
But first of all, thank you so much, Christina, for having me on the show here today. I really
it's a pleasure.
Am thankful for the opportunity to get to chat with your patrons. That's so cool.
Oh, thank you. And you both do comic storytelling. I do a lot of picture book storytelling, and what my Patreon is mostly about is sketching, which I have found as a practice really fuels my ability to do storytelling both in comic and picture book form. It sort of is a mixture of, I want to say, relaxation, and sort of it keeps the pressure off. When you illustrate for a living, it's really easy to get burnt out, and there's lots of strategies for how to keep from getting burnt out. And I think the key, and you'll have to let me know if you agree, is doing some of your own work, keeping something that's only yours.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you and I are in a unique scenario in that we are sort of like mid-career artists at this point. We've been doing this for a couple decades or so at this point. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm getting to the point where I can pick and choose the client work that I want to do with a lot more discernment. Basically doing the stuff I want to do and being able to turn down the stuff I don't.
Exactly. The joy of saying no.
Right. And that's a really incredible place to be, especially from what probably you and I have known for the majority of our careers, which is like, fighting from the bottom and starting out and trying to take any job you can. And, doing that over the course of a couple decades, you build up your skills as an artist, you build up your desirability as an artist. And because of that, we start being able to make our own choices. So I don't know. I feel like I'm in a pretty lucky place right now because I'm doing work that I want to do. I'm designing neon signs. I never even knew that was something that was possible in this life before, maybe about 7 years ago. And then I'm designing watches for London-based company, Mr. Jones Watches, that you mentioned just a little bit ago. That's another dream job that, I pinch myself
cool.
sometimes.
I really like the designs of them.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, amazing.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I'm going to stop yapping and let you direct me to where you want to go. I'm not sure where you want to take this interview.
I think I had said, I thought it was cool that you had done work with them. I mean, that's one of the great things of the internet is that you can get clients from all over. I mean, I've worked for clients in London, and I have a Swiss client that I'm working on my fourth book for. And it's exciting that as long as they can wire you money, you can work for anyone. I mean,
yep.
I think the exciting thing now is that, most of the projects any of the projects I take on are ones that I'm excited about, and you're probably the same way. So, one thing, talking about your own personally fueled projects, like how do you flesh them out in your sketchbook? What is your process?
Hmm. So I know that you are a big proponent of sketchbooks, and I know many people are too. But for a very long time, I have been real bad about keeping sketchbooks. I would purchase them and think, boy, this is a lovely object of art, and I am going to put some things in here. And inevitably, I had this feeling of pressure. Like what I put in there needed to be really good because I'd buy this thing that I thought was really pretty, and then I'd want to put beautiful things in there. And inevitably, it was just sketches and it didn't feel like it matched where it was going. And so, for most of my career, I've just sort of like grabbed a piece of computer paper on the side of my desk and just, scrawled whatever and used that to help me get going on projects because it was so um, I'm struggling for the words here. Unpretentious, unprecious, I
It's
guess.
more ephemeral, maybe.
Yeah, and I didn't feel any pressure to make it any particular way. It didn't have to be good when I was scrawling out on a piece of 1 cent paper. But when I got into a sketchbook, I felt like, oh boy, the pressure's on now. I've got to make something good. And I would feel real bad if something didn't come out the way I was hoping it would. And it seemed like most of the time I was doing it, it was not coming out the way I hoped it would. So only in recent days have I started keeping sketchbooks. Like I would say in the past year and a half or so, when I started compiling work for this new book I'm making, which we'll talk about soon. It's an art book of my work from the past 20 years. I started looking around for a bunch of process work for this book. I'd have final pieces, but my art book, like yourself, I am an educator and I like to share process. I love to see process from different artists. And when I would look around at a bunch of different art books, I would see either one end of the spectrum or the other, meaning on one hand, I'd see just single images and that was it. No explanation, no process, just sort of like a gallery in book form. And that left me feeling a little bit empty. Like I want to understand more about this work. Like when was it made? What was it made for? Was it made for a client? Was it a personal work? Was it published anywhere? I want to know some of this stuff and maybe even a story behind why it was created. And on the other hand, I'd see art books with just pages and pages and mountains of text. And that overwhelmed me too. Like I want art in my art book. And so for this book that I'm creating, I'm really trying to strike that balance where I am basically taking a spread, 2 pages for each finished piece. And on the right-hand side is going to be a full page, full color version of the finished piece. But on the left-hand page, I'm going to include just a few sentences, a paragraph or two, talking about how the piece came about. Then I'm going to show like pencils moving into inks and color options and leading into the final piece on the next page. So you can kind of see how this piece came together. So all that to say, in looking for that process work for this new art book of mine that I'll be launching next year, 2023, I really had to do a lot of treasure hunting in order to find this stuff. And so I thought to myself, well, what if I just started doing all my preliminary work in a single place? And so I looked up a sketchbook that was about the size that I usually draw on. I made sure to get one that did not look very good. It was just like, staple
No
bound or
pressure.
sewn bound. Exactly. Yeah. So it did not feel precious. And then I could just get in there and make any poopy drawing that would lead into a better drawing, but I didn't feel that pressure that I did before. So now I've got this sketchbook archive of preliminary process images that I can now go to if I need to find something. So that's how I've sort of come into sketchbooking somewhat late in my artistic career and in pretty recent days.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's how many people, I mean, there are people that from the beginning keep sketchbooks, but I mean, I illustrated books for many years and didn't keep sketchbooks. I probably didn't start seriously keeping them till 2011.
Hmm.
I mean, I had them, but I didn't, contribute to them every day till then. And perhaps one of the reasons I got into them, and I don't know, maybe if this is true for you too, was perhaps a little bit of burnout, is that I fell in love with urban sketching and just sketching on location. And because it was so low stakes, it was just something for me and something fun for me to do that was, and also kind of sometimes feel as a little naughty because, I should be working on something else. So it's kind of like you're cheating on yourself, you're kind of going out and doing your own thing. And I think that that's something as people mature as artists, perhaps they start using and utilizing more. I'm trying to get more into even keeping more of a diary and writing stuff down. And when I do my webcomic, I try to sketch ideas for that. And a lot of times I come up with ideas with that when I'm not, at home, when I'm doing something or somebody says something funny that seems like it would work for the Crone cartoon, then I'll doodle it in there for future reference. And so it's a great resource.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up the artist mentality of feeling like you should be working on one particular project, but then sort of like playing hooky with some other project. And that feeling is something I feel very much a kinship with. It must be a universal artistism that we feel
Yes.
this. But in recent days, I've been doing these mirror doodles where basically I will sketch in like a corner of my sketchbook and then I'll scan that in and I'll duplicate it around 4 times so that it creates this larger drawing. They're sort of like mandala-esque, but they could be figurative, they could be totally abstract, but whatever it is, for most of them I've just been putting ink to page, like not penciling beforehand, just letting whatever comes out come
Mm-hmm.
out. And to rewind just a little bit further, in the early part of this year, I ran a Kickstarter campaign for my most recent comic book, which is a collaboration between my late grandfather and I. My late grandfather wrote this poem called A Hunter's Tale that has resonated with me for a great number of years. It's about empathy and these two seemingly very different subjects, a hunter and his prey, find this mutual understanding of one another. And for the longest time, I've wanted to make this poem of his visual in some way. And so over the course of the second half of 2021, I illustrated and colored this in comics form. And then in January 2022, ran a Kickstarter campaign for it, and then proceeded to print and fulfill those books over the next few months. I mention all that to say that since that fulfillment and campaign, that was a ton of work. Like I did this month-long tour where I did a different interview on a different website every single day for 31 days of the campaign. That was a lot. And then on top of that, coordinating printing, et cetera, and then packing and fulfilling all those orders. I was spent. And after that, I felt like I was really kind of wiping my artistic brow for a while and trying to figure out a way to get back into things and get motivated about artwork. And these mirror doodles were a really low stakes way to get back into it, to get my hands moving again. And I've really enjoyed the process, and I've been sharing them with my patrons on my Patreon. And I've been getting some really good feedback on them, and to the point where I just shared it with my email list, and they seem to enjoy them too. I didn't know that it was going to be anything, but I'm sincerely considering making a book out of them in the not too distant future. I've been doing these for a little while now. I've got several handfuls of them compiled at this point, and if I've got them already, why not toss them between a couple covers and let people have a physical copy or a digital copy if they want. So coming up later this year, I'll be running a campaign for my Mirror Doodles book.
Oh, neat. I mean, it's a way to relax. Again, it goes back into bringing making it low stakes and not like part of your, I hate the word side hustle, but it seems like so much of whenever someone is doing work these days, it's sort of like, how are you going to monetize it? And a lot of times, like when you do something that's precisely what, I don't want to say what you shouldn't be doing, but there's something freeing about just doing work just for you and just no stakes and doodling that. I mean, I think that that's almost a meditative practice, really.
Big time. Yeah. Yeah. It's just this slow building out from a center, this like slowly adding on, thinking, am I done yet? Am I not? I don't know. How am I feeling? I guess I'll add on some more, wheel the thing together and be surprised at the end of all that. But you're exactly right. It's very meditative. And I like what you're saying about these low stakes or no stakes projects. And this was a no stakes project for me. Now it's sort of shifting a little bit because I am going to put it into a book, but that was not my intention when I first started. I originally saw this idea from a fellow cartoonist friend of mine. His name is Merrick Bennett, and he's also on Patreon. You can find him at merrickbennett.com. And I'm a patron of his. And I would see him post these mirror doodles every once in a while. And I thought, that's interesting. This was like right after I fulfilled this massive campaign. I'm like, maybe I'll try one of those. And I just, started doodling around in my sketchbook and mirrored it out in Photoshop, and like, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll do another. And it's sort of become a practice. I've been doing one or two a week. And now that I know these are going to go into a book, I'm sort of ramping it up to once every day or two. I'm making these to the point where I'll be ready to publish them in a book, which is going to be pretty soon.
It almost sounds like it's a stream of consciousness kind of thing. Which I do stream of consciousness drawings that are kind of weird, but I like the idea of it almost like having no real direction.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I think there's also an element of like puzzle piecing with these. And I've noticed that as part of my work that I really enjoy. There's some sort of, I'm not sure how to articulate it, but it's like custom puzzle making, puzzle solving, where like there's not a puzzle already out there that you open the box and you put the pieces together. But like with a page of comics, you're trying to figure out, okay, how many panels on a page is there going to be? Where's the biggest panel? What does it need to emphasize? Where are the characters going to go in this panel? How is the word balloon or two or three going to fit in there? There's a lot of puzzle piecing and graphic design when it comes to making comics. The same is true for things like neon design, which I do. So like in neon design, you cannot cross lit tubes, especially when you have them animated. Otherwise, when the back one is lit, then the front one is going to become illuminated as well. So you really have to sort of consider how these tubes of glass are going to fit and interact with each other. Yeah. And likewise with like watch design, there is different types of movements that they call them in watches, where it could be like a central axle where, the hour and the minutes hand whirl around, or there's a 24-hour mechanism where it's 24 hours versus 12, or there's different types of mechanical movements, like a jump hour movement, where the hour and the minutes and the seconds are all on different axes in that movement. And I mention all this to say, watchmaking and designing is another puzzle to like figure out and fit together. Like, how are you going to put all these different illustrated pieces and allow them to move in this dynamic way, but fit together too? Like, again, another form of puzzle piecing. And again, this comes back to this mirror doodle thing that I've been doing, because when I'm mirror doodling, yes, it's low, no stakes, but I'm also using my mind in a way that I feel like is this low stakes custom puzzle piecing, custom puzzle solving, like exists in a lot of my other work, where I'm trying to think about, okay, how is this going to fit seamlessly into this cut, into this mirror that I'm going to place right here? Or how can I mask the fact that there is a seam right here. Like instead of putting, sometimes I'll have figurative elements in my mirror doodles. And so if I put a face right next to a line, well, when it's mirrored, you're going to see that replication of the face and know that, oh, okay, that's where the thing was mirrored. But if I simply shift that head over so that it cuts in half and I only draw half the head, then it looks like the whole head is there. And it sort of masks the fact that there's a seam there because we're used to seeing that symmetrical hole in a person or an animal's face. So, trying to think about different ways to create these mirrored images. And like, I'm still experimenting. Like I started looking into mandalas and looking at ones that I really enjoyed and seeing that the ones I enjoyed did not have this super regular mirrored pattern to them. Like it wasn't multiples of 2 or 4 or 8, but I'd see ones that were odd numbers like 5, or even weird numbers like 10, where, it doesn't quite divide into that quarter nicely. But if you do a little bit of math, 10 divided by 4 equals 2.5. So really, if you take a quarter, I could get 2.5 elements in there and then mirror it so that it looks like there's 10. But in order to do that, you've got to be super precise about it. So I created this 10-point radius, this 10-point star in Illustrator and printed it out and made some concentric circles around it and simply slipped it behind my sketchbook page and started getting a little bit more precise with these sketchbook mirror drawings. And that's a new part of this mirror drawing that I've been experimenting with just in the past like week or so. I was sort of mulling that problem, that puzzle around in my head for a while, trying to figure out how else can I mask this quad mirrored illustration, and started playing around with that. So anyway, I've been having a lot of fun with it.
It's interesting because it seems like your practice is very much kind of coming up with different ways to structure storytelling and how people take in artwork and that sort of thing. And that's one thing we both teach college students. And I find one of the most, where you were talking about problem solving, I think that one thing a sketchbook helps with is, like, a regular sketching practice really helps you come up with much better solutions from a problem solving standpoint. And I have really developed it. And actually, my sketchbook is going to be very much about, I have a bunch of exercises I do with my students in there to get sketches down as quickly as possible, like how to capture that. A lot of times coming up with a sketch is sort of a lightning in a bottle kind of thing, where you're trying to capture something. And a lot of times, and this is, more advanced illustration practice, sometimes you'll sketch something out. I love thumbnail sketches. And I always, when I do comics and when I do picture books, I always thumbnail them. And the hardest thing is when you do the tight sketch or the final art and you look back at your thumbnail and you're like, why does that look better? It's so much cooler and like has so much more energy. And it's one of the things I've discussed with many artists before, is like, why does that little tiny thumbnail you did look much more interesting and work so much better?
Yeah. Again, it probably comes back to that low stakes thing where nobody's going to see this little thumbnail image, and so you're just working quickly and loosely and in a very carefree way. But when you start refining it, you're like, okay, this is the thing that people are going to look at. And then it comes back to that element of pressure again. But I've heard artists talk about the same thing you just mentioned, where like thumbnail feels loose and free, and then it gets too tight when I start to tighten it up. But I've noticed in my own work that I'll feel really inhibited about how my pencils are coming out. Like they just look like a mess. And then I'll just sort of power through them. And by the time I'm done with inks and like step away from it for a night and come back the next morning, I'm like, oh, that's not so bad after all. Like when I see the finished piece, I don't know. I feel like there's something about inking a piece for me that I think I've developed a confidence in inking that I know I know exactly what I need to do when it comes to that stage. Whereas like the pencils, even if I've thumbnailed something out, I feel like there's still a lot of decision making to be
There
done in the
is, yeah.
pencil phase. And that's like the thinky stage. It's like writing in a way. Like I cannot listen to music or be distracted while I'm penciling, but I can have a conversation with you till the cows come home if I'm inking or if I'm coloring. Like that is the rote stuff that I'm perfectly comfortable with. But pencils, ooh boy, that's like you're making the baby at that point, and you want to make a pretty baby, right? You don't want
Exactly.
an ugly baby. And
It
that's,
takes a lot of concentration.
yeah, for sure.
And I think that it's interesting because it takes a while sometimes to convince students to do. I don't know if you've had that problem. Like sometimes it's they just want to get into doing final art without any sort of planning or anything.
Yep.
And like you've just described, it's part of the problem solving phase. Like if you don't do
Yes.
that, you'll be in big trouble. I mean, not only just for clients. I mean, obviously for clients, when you do a picture book, you can't just send them final artwork, unless you like redoing stuff a lot. I mean, I guess if you,
Right.
but also just for yourself and making a better product, just thinking about it in that way in sketch form is so useful. And I always tell people that the thing that most artists, and this kind of gets away from sketching as a relaxing practice, but a lot of people tend not to realize that as illustrators and as designers as well, because we do a lot of graphic design, and my background is actually industrial design, so I've done industrial design as well. But your biggest asset is not necessarily how well you render something or how well you draw something, but how well you problem solve and how well you story tell. I mean, those are the most important things, and that's what our real profession is. And so when you talk about problem solvings and puzzles and stuff, that actually is what we do. And telling people that really what the value of doing sketches for a client and not just sending the final art is, you are doing that problem solving and giving them options and making it better. And the thumbnails are more for you, but it's so that you have a better product. And I said that ultimately helps you as an illustrator be able to charge what you're worth, because if you just give a final piece of art, they don't have any inkling of the process or what it takes to redo something. But if you start from the beginning and say, we're going to be doing this in a process, you're going to see sketches, and then we're going to work with the designer and stuff, you see the process, and then you have a stake in it and understand that has a value.
Yes, completely agreed. It took me a long time to figure that out as an artist, because I think in art school, when I was younger, I just wanted the finished piece and didn't realize how important all the steps were. But then piggybacking on top of that, moving toward client work, I was the same way. But I found out when I started being very explicit with clients and saying, okay, here's my cost, and I'm going to need 50% up front and 50% upon completion. But here's what you can expect from me. First, you're going to get 3 penciled roughs, and you can choose which one of these you want, and make some revisions if you want. Then we'll move on to inks, and again, you get final approval on this, and you get a round of revisions if you want. And then we're going to move on to colors, round of revisions, and then we're done. But when they are brought along on that path to creating it, it makes the client feel far more engaged, far more a part of how that piece of artwork came to be, instead of, as you said, just presenting a final piece and then you got to go back to the drawing board regardless and change a bunch of things. So I think it works well on both sides. For the client, it makes them feel more invested, and for the artist, you're saving yourself a lot of time by bringing the client along, because then the client says, okay, I like sketch number 2 when you thought sketch number 1 was the strongest. And maybe it is, but they're the one with the money and paying you. So go do that sketch that they wanted, right? And then moving forward, they have a say in each of those steps. And you don't have to go from step 5 back to step 1. You just have to go from step 1 to like a little revision and then moving forward from there. So it works out well for everybody if you can lay out the process for your client at the very beginning, and then they know what you're getting, and everybody's on the same page essentially, instead of just like saying I charge an hourly wage. Like that's ridiculous. Don't make your client fear how long you're going to take to do this project. Understand what the client wants, and then estimate what your time is worth, and then give them a flat fee. So
and one of the
everyone's happy.
things, yeah, and one of the things we were talking about is as our careers progress, is that we as our careers progress, we want to do more of our own thing. And I think that that's a fascinating aspect of, being, as you go on you want to do your own thing. So kind of talk a little bit, the book that you did, which was your grandfather's poem, which was really nice. I got a copy of it and I enjoyed reading it. Tell me a little bit about how, when you're your own hardest client, kind of when you're doing something like that, getting motivated to do your own piece like that and doing these art books and stuff takes a level of dedication that's not the same when you have someone kind of breathing down your neck. Like you said, everything, the buck stops, everything stops with you.
Yeah. So I don't know. So for that project in particular, like I said, that poem had been with me ever since I can remember. It was written in 1982, 83. So I would have been, 2 or 3 years old at the time it was written. I don't remember a time it was not in my life, to make a long story short. And that poem is something I've come back to over the years when, I don't know, I just need a recharge or need to feel connected with family, and be reminded of someone in my family who had a creative practice too. And yeah, so anyway, it's been with me for a very long time. And like I said, I've always wanted to make it visual in some way, but I think there was a confluence of a number of different things that happened in the past couple of years, which really lit a fire under me to tackle that project. One was the pandemic, and we were all, trying to deal with this in our own way. And I came back to that poem of my grandfather's again and was just reminded all over, like, oh, this is so great. I really want to share this with more people. And so that was one of the things. Another thing was the Black Lives Matter movement over the course of the pandemic, George Floyd, and countless other atrocities, really, in our
other
world.
Atrocities, for sure, yeah.
Really made me think more sharply about what I wanted to produce and what I wanted to put out into the world and what was important to me. And this poem of my grandfather's was, it's a poem about empathy, about radical empathy. And I feel like our world is becoming so divided, no matter what side you're on. It's almost like there's these proverbial walls going up where people are no longer listening to each other anymore. I feel like we used to be better at trying to see the other side, again, regardless of what side you're on. And we've all become pretty bad at that. And I feel like this message of empathy is something that is really needed in the world right now. So I wanted to put that out into the world too. And another thing that sort of happened into my life was a very tiny comic book called Tradition by a Hmong American artist named Dua Chaka Her. And I stumbled into this through a subscription to Craig Thompson's most recent book called Ginseng Roots. And he was documenting the Hmong American population and how they have been a central part of ginseng farming in rural Wisconsin, which is like one of the hubs of ginseng farming in the world, not just in America. So he featured this artist in one of his books, and there was an accompanying book along with it. And when I held that book in my hand, it just felt so good. This tiny size. It was 4 1/8 wide by 5 1/4 inches tall. And I remember getting out a ruler and measuring 4 1/8 by 5 1/4, calling up my printer and saying, "Hey, can we print a book this size?" And he says, "Yep, we can do that." So I got a few quotes from him, and initially I was having things quoted out as like a duotone book, just black and one color on paper, white paper or cream paper, what have you. And oddly enough, it ended up being negligibly more money to print full color
Oh,
than
nice.
duotone. So at that point, I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to fully color this thing. So that's how that came to be. And then the rest was history. Did that campaign in January 2022 and super funded. I think it quadruple funded.
Excellent.
It just really blew me away at the support of that campaign, and since got national distribution through Diamond Comics, and now it's in comic book stores all over the place.
It's an amazing piece, and that's kind of where those things are born. It's sort of it like hearing the origin story of how you came up with it is really interesting, and it's actually a great place to end the interview, because it's such a perfect description of practice and inspiration, and coming up with your own intellectual property. And I think that's what we all try to do, like you said, and just people having more empathy. And I think that's a great inspiration that's always, and we can talk a little bit, you're going to interview me a little bit later about why I got into urban sketching. And I always loved, they have a manifesto, which is sort of like we show the world one drawing at a time, and we record the world around us. And it's such a beautiful manifesto, because it's sort of, it doesn't matter how good you are, whether you're professional or not professional, you're trying to share your world and your practice with other people in the world. And I think that that's such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, agreed. And just to clarify for your listeners a little bit, if you've made it this far, thank you so much. Christina mentioned that we are sort of doing a tag team interview here. So Christina just
Good
interviewed
segue.
me, and I thank you so much for doing so. But I also have a Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/Ryan Claytor. That's RyanClaytor. And I am going to interview Christina. So if you would like to know more about the person you're already supporting on Patreon, please hop over there. I'm going to include my interview of Christina right there. So Christina and patrons, thank you so much for having me on your podcast here. I super
It's been wonderful.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you.
much. Great
Yeah,
talking
thank
to you.
you.